The first thing we will be going over today is basically what is psychology. And the big point I want to kind of drive home to you guys is that psychology in its modern form is more of a science than a humanity. Seeing where psychology has come and kind of the different ways people approach it is something that's really interesting and informs you to better comprehend these different topics that we'll be going over. So I wanted to open up the floor to you guys just to start it off. What do you guys know about psychology? Maybe like you saw like a TV show where there's a psychologist, or like kind of what idea of psychology do you guys have in your minds as of now? All right, so how human brains work in certain situations. Yep, that's right. Scientific study of the mind and behavior, human brain and functions. What all of you guys said, that's exactly right. It's great that all of you kind of mentioned like brains, like thinking, and also kind of behavior, because definitely when you see psychologists working and kind of the study of psychology, there's a lot of emphasis on the brain and also thought processes that go behind our behaviors. Chloe mentioned something interesting, the idea of brains working in certain situations. So kind of like the idea of our environment playing a role in our behaviors as well. Let's see, from San Ko, I read this book where there was this psychologist from MIT, and it was really cool. He claimed that everyone was a psychic. Cool, that sounds interesting. Some things that in psychology do seem like not under the surface, a little bit psychic, but they're understandable if you get like a basic understanding of it. So yeah, all of you guys have really great ideas so far. Okay, yeah, so what is psychology? On the most basic level, it is the study of behavior and thought processes. Not as eloquent as what many of you guys said, but that's kind of the basic idea. So here's the point I kind of wanted to drive in. Modern psychology is pretty much a science. And it's not a science in the way that, as you see here, like you have microscopes or chemicals or flasks, you're mixing chemicals or doing experiments. It's a science because it relies on critical thinking and the scientific method. This drawing of a dissected pig, a long, long time ago, was Rene Descartes, and he was the great mathematician of his time, the Cartesian plane and everything, but his approach to psychology was not a science. He basically dissected animals and said, wow, I think that means that we think in this way or that. So it's kind of just a totally random kind of approach to psychology based on something not scientific. So I guess like this raises the question, so what about common sense? Why can't we use common sense to sort of reason things out? We know more than Descartes did like 200 or 300 years ago. Why can't we just make those assumptions? Well, here are three reasons why. So hindsight bias, or I told you so. Looking at this little cartoon, you see these two people looking at a plane crash, and they're saying like, even though we helped them build it, I always knew it was a bad idea. So kind of saying, I told you so. I knew it all along. That's kind of one of the reasons why psychology needs to follow a scientific process. There's always that tendency, especially something we should know so much about as our own behavior, to sort of say, okay, I would have known that all along about a certain conclusion. And then overconfidence is another kind of phenomena where we're more confident than we are right. You see this a lot when you're taking tests, kind of like you come to an answer, you're not sure about it, and let's say it's a multiple choice exam and you have four options. So hopefully you'll not just pick a random one, sort of narrow it down. But when you have like two options or something, a lot of people, they notice that they start siding with one option just like for the sake of time or coming to an answer, but they're more confident about that answer without really thinking about why sometimes. And that's what overconfidence is. You think you're right more than you're actually right. And this is a problem, especially in psychology, because it can present biases when you're researching. All right. So then the last one is something really interesting. Human beings, we have a tendency to perceive patterns in random events. So kind of like an example here, if a couple has three girls in a row, are they more likely to have a boy or a girl for the next child? Does anyone know? One out of two. Yeah, Daniel, you're right. It's still 50% chance. But a lot of people, they think, well, since they already had three girls, wouldn't it make sense for them to have a boy to sort of compensate for that or something? Shouldn't there be a logical pattern to this? But no, that's kind of the idea of perceiving patterns in random events. Going back to kind of like the testing example, when like I'm taking a Scantron and I'm bubbling in the answers, I go A, and I'm like, wait a minute, that can't be right. There can't be four A's in a row when it is still a completely random 1 out of 4 chance. So this idea of perceiving these patterns when they're non-existent is another reason why we can't sort of rely on our own intuition. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, Jehu, Eva, Daniel, and Grace, all of you are absolutely correct. It doesn't matter, but a lot of people at first glance might think it does matter. So how do they think critically? Well, back to the good old scientific method. I'm sure all of you guys have been lectured to death on the scientific method in school, but kind of the idea, you start with an observation, then you build a theory. It's like not fully fleshed out yet. And then you go through a more formal hypothesis that's hopefully more specific than your theory. And then you actually test that and you hopefully reach a conclusion that is justified by that test. Quickly here, someone had a question, why isn't it more likely to have a boy? And kind of it's a chance process, even though there's like some tendencies in some cases, since it's random how the chromosomes divide and determine gender. Most of the time it's 50%. That's why I was talking about that in the previous slide. So how do we test their hypothesis? So if you look at this step, there's a test step. So how exactly do we do that? So there's a few different ways. First, case studies. So case studies are focusing on a specific case, hence the name case study. So it focuses on a specific individual who displays some interesting behavior or something that you hope will provide better insight to the greater population. It doesn't have to be a specific individual. It can also be a specific community. For example, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is a great case study on the effects of carbon dioxide levels rising. The second way is naturalistic observation. So here, the psychologist or the researcher plants themselves in the natural scene without trying to influence any outcomes or behaviors. They're just simply observing and kind of trying to reach conclusions based on what they observe. So it's a lot of tedious note-taking, being really attentive to details in naturalistic observation. So surveys, you guys probably have some experience with these, but surveys is where the responses are sent out to a certain population or a sample of that population, and those responses are usually the population kind of or sample self-rating themselves or giving a response that hopefully is honest. So as you can see, there's positives and negatives to all of these case studies. They're specific, but they can also be difficult to generalize. Naturalistic observation, you get the full extent of being in an undisturbed environment, but there's also the chance that this environment is not completely usual or kind of undisturbed as you might hope. And surveys, there's a bunch of things wrong with surveys, kind of like going from the wording and to how many people actually respond. So Jane Goodall, she's an example of the first two types of studies we have, because she spent decades in Tanzania observing chimpanzee behavior. So that's a case study in the fact that she focused on a specific community of chimpanzees, not the whole chimpanzee population. It's also naturalistic observation because, as many of you might know, she didn't go there and conduct tests on the chimpanzees or try to disturb their habitats. She just watched from a distance and kind of immersed herself naturally without trying to alter their behavior. So it's naturalistic observation in that way as well. So all of those first three options of testing hypotheses are great. But the most, I guess the one that scientists really want to go for are experiments, because these are the only ones that can thoroughly prove causation. For example, a psychologist might be thinking, well, if I use this drug, will it cause a reduction in the rate of depression among my patients? Well, the only way the psychologist could possibly test that is through an experiment. I'm sure you guys have learned about experiments, so I won't go too into depth. Basically, an experiment involves different treatments where you have a control group that doesn't receive the treatment, an experimental group, or groups that do receive a certain type of treatment. And basically, by comparing the experimental groups to the control groups, you can kind of see if what you're testing, the experimental group, actually caused a significant change from the control group. This little cartoon, kind of what I was trying to get at, was another psychological phenomenon associated with experiments called the placebo effect. Could any of you guys guess at what that is? Maybe by looking at the cartoon or from what you guys already know? Yeah, so they do nothing, something that you think does something but doesn't, no effect. Yeah, so placebo is basically kind of like an inactive drug or an inactive treatment researchers give to the control group because they want to seem like they're giving them something, but in actuality, it's inactive. It doesn't have a real effect. But sometimes, just because the subjects of the experiment think that the placebo will have an effect, there is a positive effect. So kind of the joke here, I guess, in this cartoon is that a lot of, I guess, store-bought drugs, the ones you get at Ralph's, there's like this idea, like, do they really do anything? Or is it just me thinking, just because I'm taking a drug, I'll get better? That positive thought affecting the positive change we think we see. So that's kind of what the cartoon is playing with. And another interesting psychological phenomenon within experimentation. Another thing I wanted to sort of convey to you guys is that psychology is a fairly modern science. I guess with the example of Descartes, even 300, 400, 500 years ago, people were still resorting to dissecting pigs to sort of think about and find out how we think and act. But the first kind of example of the scientific approach to understanding how people, humans, think and behave started in 1689 with John Locke. He was a British thinker. He focused on politics, on science, and he developed this idea of the tabula rasa. So Locke's idea was human beings, we are like tabula rasas. We are blank slates when we first start out as children, as babies. But our experiments, experiences, what we learn, our memories, those basically fill up the slate, and those will turn us into the people we become 20 or 30 years from now. And that kind of idea was empiricism, understanding that knowledge doesn't come from something we innately have, but it comes from experience and observation. All right, so the first psychologist, like in the psychology, any course you'll go through, they'll say the first psychologist was Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, if you pronounce the W's as in English. And he worked in a lab, and his first real psychological experiment was in 1879. And basically, this experiment, you can see this in the picture right here on the right, basically involved Wundt sitting in a chair, and these young men are his subjects. Basically, the experiment involved measuring their reaction times to various stimuli. For example, he would drop a ball and measure how quickly they would grab it, or he would measure how quickly it took them to react to him touching their arm or something. And the reason this is an example of psychology is because he was trying to figure out what was the thought process, what was the guiding influence behind these behaviors. So he was trying to understand human thoughts and behaviors, which made it a very much psychological experiment in a modern sense. So arising from this, I have written structuralism via introspection. So structuralism is basically the school of psychological thought that once developed from these experiments. And kind of taking the word and breaking it down, structure as in the word, so he focused on mental structures. What are like the different structures or aspects of our brain and our thinking processes that allow us to behave and react in such a way? And he got through this via introspection. So introspection, intra sort of meaning inwards, inspection, thinking, like speculating about something. So basically inward thinking. After conducting these experiments, he would ask his subjects to sort of reflect on what had just happened. He would ask them questions like, okay, so you saw the ball drop. What was your immediate reaction? What did you think in your mind as you went to grab that ball? Basically, it's kind of a self-exploration. So I guess another example in the 1900s, late 1900s, that is very popular in popular culture, in literature, is Sigmund Freud, kind of this man here with the cigar and the beard. And he's everywhere in the movies, in TV shows, and books. He was so revolutionary in thinking about the unconscious. He developed ideas of we think we know everything, but in reality, our actions and our behaviors are driven mostly by what we don't understand, our unconscious feelings and desires. So that's why he was so popular, because it was revolutionary thinking that we are not completely in control of our own actions and behaviors. So you see him in a lot in popular culture. For example, like the classic psychologist's office where the patient is laying down and the psychologist is writing something saying, hey, please tell me, what do you feel? So that's kind of a very Freudian approach to psychology that's you see a lot in the media. So this next slide kind of introduces the idea that there's a diversity of psychological approaches. There's different ways of approaching the same problem. And I guess for psychology, it's not a problem. It's kind of this experience of understanding human actions and thoughts. But there's different ways to sort of get at that. And that's what we're going to cover for most of this lesson. So there's no one way to sort of approach psychology. And that's really important. Yeah, Chloe says kind of like how their artist has their own style. Yeah, for example, you can have two artists who both want to, I guess, address something like climate change. They both want to address and protesting against climate change. But depending on their mediums, they might do it in a different way. One might make a photo essay. Another one might do a painting on acrylic. So there's different ways that you can approach this. And this is especially important when it comes to treatment and therapy. Kind of for many people, the benefits or what you think foremost when you think of psychology is, well, how can it work for me, or how does it help other people? There's different ways that psychologists approach this wide variety of issues and problems we face that could be addressed by psychological treatments and therapy, and different ways are tailored for specific individuals, and some work better for others and some work better for you. So as we go through, I'm going to be mentioning some psychologists. It's not really important to know about. They're just famous people you might encounter later on. But most famous psychologists we think of are famous because they developed a new approach of thinking about psychology, or they advanced it, they took it to the next level. And this third point is kind of important considering that these various schools or approaches to psychology were popular and widely used based on what information was available or known at the time. It's like thinking way back to that first example of Descartes. Honestly, he didn't have much information available to him, so he resorted to what he thought was the most natural thing, dissecting animals, which are similar to humans, to get a better understanding. So, kind of what we have around us in a society in terms of information, research capabilities, definitely does determine what kind of psychological approaches we can and choose to use. So, I guess the big question is, what does it look like today? We're in a society where we're talking on Zoom right now, where we have research equipment that can examine neuron functions and cell growth and stuff like that. So how do we take that great advancement in technology, in sciences, and how do we apply that to psychology? What's like the relationship between more traditional psychology and the modern technology? And the answer to that is it's an eclectic mixture. Did any of you guys guess maybe what eclectic means? Different, diverse? Yeah, those are close. Diverse is getting at it. It's coming out from different components, a mixture of different stuff. That's right on the point. You see this living room here, and it's an eclectic interior style because you see, I guess, this very traditional architecture combined with this very modern and kind of diverse different tastes combined in one room. That's really what modern psychology looks like. Not many psychologists kind of say, oh, I only follow Freud's method of treating patients, or no, I only focus on behavior theory. No, most of them are very, very open to all the different kind of resources and schools of thought available. And that's really what helps people, because some treatments are going to work better than others. Some approaches are more suited for certain situations than others. And that's why it's so important that psychologists have this understanding of various schools of thought. All right, so early approaches and perspectives. Great. So we already talked about Wilhelm Wundt, the first psychologist. His big school of thought was called structuralism, basically looking at mental structures. What are the structures? By structures, I mean components that allow us to think, react, and behave. And again, introspection, looking inwards and thinking inwards was his method. He would ask research subjects think about themselves, think about what was going on internally to better understand human actions. So that was the first sort of approach to psychology. And then after that came functionalism, which came primarily off Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. So could any of you guys either unmute or type in the chat, what was Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection?
Darwin's theory of natural selection was that animals or humans that have certain abilities or genes would help them adapt to a situation, and the ones that didn't have that specific trait would die. And so more and more traits of that trait would be in those animals so that they would survive in that habitat.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Chloe. Natural selection is kind of like the term survival of the fittest. Those traits that are more favorable to survive in a certain environment or circumstance will be passed on to future generations. So that was kind of the evolutionary perspective from the idea of natural selection. So basically thinking about human behavior as a trait, a fear of heights, for example. People that were afraid of heights wouldn't just go walking off a cliff and die. People that were afraid of heights would kind of stay away and survive and pass on that trait to future generations. And that's why people nowadays are still afraid of heights, even though we're in like a skyscraper or an airplane that's still pretty safe. So functionalist psychologists or psychologists practicing the evolutionary perspective, they sort of focus on that. How is this behavior an example of the theory of natural selection? How is this behavior beneficial for survival? And why might it have been passed on to us right now? So Gestalt psychology is another very early school of psychology. And they sort of focused on the idea that the parts are more than the whole. Or you can't just look at something based on its individual parts, but you must look at its whole to get the full picture. In the bottom right-hand corner, I have these images, and I guess a lot of you have seen them, but they're optical illusions. So depending on how you look at it, maybe the angle you're looking at it, or what you choose to focus on, you see 2 or even 3 different images in this one simple picture. So that's what Gestalt psychologists were looking at. Because looking at the individual parts, you don't see much. You see some black shading on the left, some white space in the middle, and some more black shading on the right. But when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, you see these very complex images that play with each other. So that's what Gestalt psychologists sort of looked at, this perception of the whole and not just the parts. And applying that to human behavior. So for example, let's say a student doesn't want to do their homework and their parents are concerned, they're showing a lack of interest, lack of energy. So they're like, why don't we talk to a psychologist? So the psychologist, instead of focusing specifically on the one issue of not wanting to do their homework, they'll focus more on the environmental factors, the whole picture of this patient as a person. What might be other environmental factors or personality factors that might make them not want to do their homework? So not just focusing on one issue, but the person as a whole is what Gestalt psychologists were really good at. So I guess going back to Sigmund Freud, the next sort of big approach in early psychology was psychoanalysis. And I already mentioned that psychoanalysis was really big on the unconscious. Thoughts, desires, intentions we have that we don't even know about. That's what Freud was sort of focusing on. And he also focused on childhood. Those childhood experiments will basically help us grow and kind of like better inform the adults we become 20 or 30 years down the line. It's not on the slide, but something I wanted to mention about Freud was that his idea was not only unconscious, but the unconscious, but how we react to that. All right, more perspectives. Yay. We'll sort of look at these two examples, Pavlovian conditioning and Skinner's conditioning. So let's start with Pavlov, since he was earlier on in what is termed classical conditioning. So he's famous in psychology as being the first one to sort of focus on this behavioral perspective, an example of classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. Initially, the dog, he drools at the sight of food. He thinks about food, he smells it, he's really hungry, and he starts drooling. And then this experimenter, Pavlov, he would ring the bell every single time the food was presented. Eventually, the dog would start to associate the bell with the food, and even when the food was not present and the bell rang, the dog would start drooling, which is the reaction he had when he smelled the food. So basically, Pavlov's conditioning, or classical conditioning, it looks at our associating different stimuli and basically reacting to one even when the other is not present because of that association. We'll go more into depth 2 or 3 weeks down the line, but kind of I wanted to give you guys a practical example on why this might be important looking at people. For example, let's say you're in school and every time your teacher claps her hands, she gives back a test. So let's say you've gotten 3 or 4 really bad test scores in a row. So when you see those test scores, you're going to feel very bad, very anxious. Your heart's going to start racing when you see these bad test scores. Eventually, after enough repetitions, you're going to start feeling that whenever your teacher starts clapping her hands, because you associated that negative reaction of receiving the test score with your teacher's clapping her hands. Now, the second kind of real important behaviorist is Skinner. He was an American psychologist. Pavlov was Russian, but you guys see this up here in the top right is basically mice running through a maze. We see it a lot in movies. Basically, Skinner, he worked on operational conditioning. He would basically put little incentives, little food rewards around the maze for rats to follow. Eventually, in about a few weeks, they would nose the maze with the back of their hand. So Skinner, he basically focused on punishments, which were designed to deter a behavior, and rewards, which were designed to encourage a behavior. That's why these rats were able to learn this behavior so well. So a reinforcer is anything that encourages or reinforces a behavior. For example, for these rats, if they did a good job running through the maze, they would get a food or a piece of cheese or something like that. And a punisher or punishment is anything that's designed to decrease a behavior or deter a behavior. For example, maybe if they took a wrong turn, they would shock the rat, sadly, as a punishment or not give it food. So that's how Skinner basically approached learning. And again, I want to bring this back to people because that's really why psychology is interesting. Let's go back to the test example because that's something we can hopefully all relate to. So let's say you do really well on the test. You get your report card back. You really practically aced all the tests in one quarter. And your parents are like, yes, we'll buy you a present. So you buy a present, you get this great video game set, you get the latest PlayStation, and that's a positive reinforcer of that behavior, of good study habits that ultimately led to the results that your parents are trying to encourage. Or let's say you didn't put in the work and got not so good test scores in a row. Your parents might do something as make you do extra chores. That would be adding a punishment that tries to deter that behavior via Skinner's idea of operational conditioning. Okay, yeah, Grace actually raised something interesting. This has actually been proven to be ineffective, though. Okay, this is something interesting, but the idea of intrinsic motivation and external motivation is something that Grace is bringing up. Because intrinsic, can anybody guess that word? What intrinsic means? Inside, internal. Yes. Yeah. So let's say I'm really intrinsically motivated to play music because it's something I really like to do. I'm not like having to have like my parents force me to play music. That's not what I like. So that's an intrinsic motivation. It's coming from inside versus external motivation. The example I just gave was where the student, they only work hard because they know they're going to get that PS5 or that Xbox 360 or something. They only work hard because there's that external reward that their parents are giving them to do well. And Grace, she brought up these studies that show that intrinsic motivation is much more effective at promoting long-term success and happiness than external motivation, because there's only so many PlayStations you can buy. There's only so many Xboxes you can buy. And when the going gets tough, that really intrinsic motivation is what produces those long-term positive results. So yeah, thanks Grace for bringing that up. That's a really good point. And Chloe, she just said, wouldn't the external motivation also bring people down if they couldn't make it, like grades? Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why a lot of schools have started going test optional, not A, B, C, D, E, F grading system, because even though it does encourage positive behavior, such as working harder on the next test because you want to get that A, or being nicer to your friends because you want to be a part of the team or something like that, or you want to get a good grade in PE or something. But there's kind of like this idea of if you get repeatedly, no matter what you do, you get a C, you can't bring it up to a B. But no matter what you do, you study hard, you talk to your teacher, you do the research, no matter what, you don't get that B. So that's why grades can be bad, because it promotes this loss of agency. And agency is a word that sort of means the belief that you can do something, that you can change something. And that's kind of another interesting thing that I'm kind of going on a tangent on here, but related to internal and external motivation is also internal versus external locuses or loci of control. And this is another important factor of motivation and basically internal versus external motivation, because an internal locus of control basically says, I have control over my life. I can change my behavior. I can improve it. I have that power. Whereas an external locus of control might be, I can't do anything. It was because I don't live in Beverly Hills. I don't live in Los Angeles. I can't do this. I don't live near a baseball field. I can't be a baseball player. These external uncontrollable factors. So the idea is that you want to believe you have an internal locus of control. You want to believe that you can change something. You can do something with your own agency as a human being. And that's very closely related to intrinsic motivation. So the next perspective I wanted to introduce to you guys was the cognitive perspective. And the cognitive perspective sort of focuses on how we interpret, process, and remember events, memories, what happens to us, our actions. And the most important thing, cognition, is how we approach our own perspective on a certain aspect. I know that was like a word jumble right there. So I'll give you guys an example. Let's say a college student is really, really sad and depressed, and they go to talk to a psychologist, a cognitive psychologist. So if we're looking at the cognitive approach, the psychologist might say, why do you feel so depressed? And the college student might be, oh, it's because I haven't been doing well in my sports games. I feel so down. Maybe the college athlete says that. So the cognitive psychologist might say, hey, you're interpreting or you're approaching sports incorrectly in a negative way that's damaging your mental health. If you don't win the next sports game, what's going to happen? What's the worst that can happen? And gradually, hopefully, the psychologist will make the athlete understand that losing or winning a sports game isn't what's really most important compared to other things such as health, happiness, and all those great things. So that's the cognitive perspective. The psychologist in making the athlete approach and interpret their failures in an athletic team in a different way that is more beneficial for their long-term mental health and stability. So that's kind of what cognitive psychologists might do. So humanist perspectives, this focuses on individual choice and free will. I know that sounds very like a buzzword. That's great, freedom, yay. But this was so important for psychology because if you look at previously what came before, you had functionalism, which focused on evolution, Gestalt psychology, which focused in on our perceptions, Freud psychoanalysis, which focused on the unconscious, and childhood. Those are all things we can't control. If you think about it, that's really dark and kind of saddening to think about because let's say all these theories say that what happens the first 20 years of your life will permanently change the kind of person you are 20 or 30 years down the line. But humanists, they focus on choice and free will, meaning that no, your fate is not set in stone, as Freud said, as once said. You can change things. You have that internal locus of control. They focused on the potential for human growth. And it might sound like very vague, like what is this potential for human growth? But it's basically focusing on individuals as human beings. And one of the most widely used strategies is reflective listening. When a client comes to a psychologist saying, hey, I'm having this trouble, the psychologist reflects those feelings, say, I understand you, I get what you're saying. And basically through that, you acknowledge their feelings and focus on how you can adapt and overcome these problems, not just say, too bad, just because you had a terrible childhood, you're never going to be happy. That's not what humanist psychologists are about. They want to see potential for human beings to get better and to continue to reach their potentials. All right, so now let's go to the most contemporary perspectives. And hopefully, as you can guys see with these very long names that mix and match a bunch of prefixes and suffixes, this is the most eclectic approach, the most mixture-like approach, since they're the most modern. So biopsychology or neuroscience actually is basically focusing on the biological factors that compel us to act the way we do. Some examples, your brain structure, the endocrine system, the hormones in your blood, such as adrenaline that really get you pumped up, basically these biological factors, and especially genes. How much of what we become is predetermined in our genetic code? That's a question, a nature versus nurture question that these psychologists are trying to answer. And an example of how that might work, let's say, for example, a treatment of depression relies heavily on neuroscience and biopsychology because antidepressants, you see this neuron in the top right, they basically affect the neuron's biological functioning to increase mood-boosting hormones and neurotransmitters called serotonin, and that's what makes people feel less depressed. So that's a very biological approach to depression. So that's what biopsychology or neuroscience is like. And then another very modern one is social cultural perspective. And that zooms out on the individual and looks at the importance of the circumstances we live in, we grow up in, that surround us. And ultimately, how do those inform and motivate our behaviors and how we think? And a good example of that has come up in various studies are the contrast between collectivist and individualist cultures. What do you guys think is the difference between a collectivist and an individualist culture? Chloe said more group-oriented for collectivists. That's right. So collectivists think more a collection of things. It's a large group or large assortment of things. So it's focusing on the group or the greater community. Individualists, you can sort of probably guess, are kind of focusing on the individual or individual achievement, individual success and goals. So something that has come up a lot in psychology is the idea of the societies, which societies promote these collectivist cultures and which societies promote individualist cultures. More often than not, the conclusion has been that Eastern cultures, the ones in Asia, for example, are more collectivist, whereas more what we call the West of the world, for example, the United States, Europe, those will be more individualist cultures. So that's kind of interesting because, for example, that might influence our own individual behavior. Let's say I just won the lottery. I won $1 billion. If I grew up in a collectivist culture, I would probably spend that on something for my family, something for even the city I grew up in. I might pay for a park or something for the neighborhood that I really love. But an individualist culture, that would motivate behavior focused on more me or more individualized goals. For example, I might take that $1 billion and buy a yacht or something like that, something for me. So that's two differences. They both have their good and bads, but that's kind of looking how the societies and cultures we grow up in do actually motivate behavior. All right, so the last one, biopsychosocial perspective. So this is the most eclectic. You can kind of see it in the word itself, but it considers biology, your environment, the social aspect, and your own internal thinking and thought processes. Those are all factors that sort of play in. Great question, Chloe and Grace. Could a society have a mix of collectivist and individualist cultures? Sure. I think growing up, that's something I definitely see, because in America, it is a very individualist culture. You see commercials, they say, the new you, buy this dieting program, and this is the new you. That's a very individualist oriented commercial. They focus on individual achievement and goals. But whereas growing up in a Korean American environment, where there's a little more emphasis on collectivist values such as family oriented goals, as also a bit of a mix, not just purely individualist, but also a bit of collectivist in my life as well. And I'm pretty sure you guys have seen that in your lives as well, kind of the mix. It's not just purely black and white. All right, so the biopsychosocial perspective. Yeah, it's the most eclectic, considers everything. And honestly, it's kind of funny to call this a perspective because it's like a mix of all of them, but it's almost like a checklist that psychologists practicing this perspective can go through. They almost think about 3 lenses of a microscope you can look at an issue with. So that's the most modern and eclectic approach nowadays. Do you guys have any questions, comments about anything that I might have covered today? Okay, Grace, is anyone familiar with the trolley situation? I think this is somewhat related to psychology. I learned it from a justice course. Yeah. So I guess for those of you that don't know, the trolley situation is kind of like a moral dilemma. So think about it this way. You're standing on a bridge and you see a trolley. Its brakes have been broken. It's not stopping anytime soon. And on the track, there are 5 construction workers on the track, and it looks like the trolley is just going to go and kill the 5 people. And then you have the other hand, the track branches off, and the trolley, if it switches positions, on the end of that branch of the track is only 1 worker. So you're standing on the bridge, and then next to you is the switch. So currently the trolley is going to kill the 5 construction workers. But if you flip that switch, it'll go and the trolley would turn, so it only kills that 1 construction worker. So the moral dilemma is, do you flip the switch? And the question that a lot of people kind of think is like the intention behind that. If you let the train go by and kill the 5 people, it's a tragedy. But if you flip the switch, there's kind of like the idea of intention, it being murder, since you said, okay, this 1 person's life is worth more than those 5 people's lives. That's kind of a choice you have to make, what is worth more. So I guess that's very much a justice course or idea of morality. But in terms of psychology, going back to maybe the social cultural approach, maybe if you value just sheer utilitarian numbers in society, 5 people are greater than 1, you'll save the 5 people. But maybe you focus more on a humanist perspective where it says, wait a minute, but people are people and all of them have an equal chance to grow. Wouldn't it be bad just to deprive this 1 person of life because there's a possibility of saving these others? Another thing that ties into what we talked about today, the idea of destiny. Well, that's an external locus of control. You don't have control over destiny, but you can say, well, I have an internal locus of control. I have power to change this situation. And that might make you flip the switch. So I don't know. It's definitely something that people have been debating about for lots and lots of years. I'm not going to be able to reach a conclusion anytime soon, but hopefully. All right, cool. So thanks so much for coming today, guys. If you guys have any questions, I can answer them if you email me. If you guys are up to it, take like 5 to 10 minutes out of your week. Just write something about which one of these perspectives really meant the most to you today, kind of which one of those seems the most interesting, and try to apply that to a situation in your life like I tried to do with those various examples. All right, thanks so much, guys. Please put your email in the chat, and then you guys are free to go. Thanks so much for coming.